In the dead of night, over the Strait of Hormuz, a massive steel array perched on the Iranian shoreline whirred to a stop. The Bavar 373 radar had finally locked onto its target. Deep within a buried launch tube, a Siad-4 missile ignited, a wall of flame licking the concrete floor. The missile ripped through its canister cap and roared into the darkness at 4,000 miles per hour, 5 times faster than a bullet. Only 50 meters away, an MQ-9 Reaper drone circled lazily. Its sensors registered the radar lock, but there was no escape. The missile did not need to strike the drone directly. Its nose cone shattered, spraying thousands of heavy metal pellets like a gigantic shotgun blast. The shards shredded the drone's light frame, snapping off a wing. The fuel tank erupted, turning the $30 million aircraft into a pile of scrap metal. The ultimate grid had just fired its first shot. The ceasefire was dead. The charred remains of the drone sank slowly as the second phase of the betrayal unfolded. 10 miles away, hidden behind the jagged rocks of Larak Island, the Iranian fast attack fleet stirred. These were Paycap-class boats, slipping through the water in total darkness, moving in a single file, one after another. Every 30 seconds, a heavy iron sphere rolled off the stern of a boat and splashed into the sea. Those were contact mines. When one of the lead spikes touched a ship's hull, a chemical reaction detonated the main charge. The boats were laying an invisible wall across the strait, hoping to lure a victim that would prove the trap worked. 2 miles to the west, a commercial oil tanker named the Stellar Glory lumbered through the shipping lane. She carried 2 million barrels of crude oil, and her massive size meant she could not turn or stop quickly. The tanker's bow crossed the invisible line, and a lead spike on one of the mines brushed the ship's red paint. Inside the spike, a glass tube shattered, mixing chemicals that sent an electrical spark into the main charge. The explosion was catastrophic. The aft of the ship ripped open, the vessel's spine sheared in half. The Iranian fleet was not finished. They wanted to ensure the strait was physically blocked by a burning wreck. One of the Paycap boats turned toward the dying tanker. A metal rail on its deck vibrated as the guidance system locked on. A NASA anti-ship missile ignited, dropping until it was only 10 feet above the water. The missile hid in the salt spray and the waves, invisible to the tanker's crew. It struck the tanker right in the middle of the massive oil storage tanks. The second blast was 10 times larger than the first. Crude oil spewed from the gaping hole, igniting and spreading across the surface of the ocean. The sea became a lake of burning black liquid. While this massacre unfolded, diplomats in cool, air-conditioned rooms in Qatar continued to type messages about ceasefires and peaceful resolutions. Their words now rang hollow. The IRGC Navy had used the peace talks as a shield to close in, enough to pull the trigger, believing that while diplomats argued, no one would dare fire back at the Iranian coast. The Paycap boats turned away from the inferno, heading back toward the safety of the Iranian shoreline. The United Nations Navy strike group in the Gulf of Oman had watched the entire sequence. The Stellar Glory still roared in flames when the United States Navy strike group in the Gulf of Oman began its response. 2EA-18G Growler jets screamed off the flight deck of the carrier, each carrying massive pods under their wings. Once they reached altitude, they flooded the air over the Iranian coast with electronic noise. On the Iranian shoreline, the Bavar 373 radar array was the brain of the ultimate grid, designed to see everything, even stealth jets. When the EA-18G Growlers turned on their pods, The Iranian radar screens went completely white, as if trying to find a single candle, while a high-powered flashlight shone directly into the eyes. The enemy, however, was not a pushover. The Bavar computers recognized the jamming and immediately began frequency hopping, searching for a gap in the US noise. For a split second, they found a hole, and inside, an Iranian missile battery, a canister cap shattered, and a Syad-4 missile ignited. If it struck, the United States would lose its main air defense jets within the first minute, sending US aircraft into a kill zone, where the enemy held the home field advantage. But the S-forces had been waiting for exactly this moment. 4 Fa-18 Super Hornet jets were already aloft, each carrying 2 GM-88 HARM missiles. The Super Hornets released a volley of 8 missiles. The 8 GM-88 HARM missiles ignited their rockets and accelerated to 1,500 miles per hour. They arced high into the atmosphere and then dove straight down the throat of the Iranian radar beams. On the ground, Iranian radar operators saw the warning and knew exactly what was coming. They shut down power on their multi-million-dollar Bavar arrays, hoping that by stopping their radio emissions, the missiles would lose their way. Yet the newest version of the AGM-88 HARM had a digital memory. The moment the Iranian radar turned onto fire, the first US missile memorized its exact GPS coordinate. It knew where the truck was parked, and the missiles continued their silent flight. 4 separate radar sites along the Iranian coast vanished in flame. The trucks carrying the massive steel arrays were tossed into the air like toys, and the concrete bunkers housing the computer brains of the grid shattered. This was the trap the United States had set. If the Iranians turned their radar back on, the missiles would find them. If they kept it off, the missiles already knew where they were. Either way, the grid died. With the radar fence unzipped, the Iranian fast attack fleet was suddenly exposed. The PACAP boats that had laid the mines tried to flee, heading toward the shallow waters near the coast, assuming the United States would not fire into a crowd. They were wrong. The United States was not using dumb bombs that hit everything in an area. It was using surgical tools. High above the boats, an MQ-9 Reaper drone hovered, its infrared camera scanning the scene. It saw the heat signatures of the PACAP engines glowing like white-hot coals. The drone operator, 500 meters away, centered a laser dot on the lead boat's fuel tank. A Hellfire missile dropped from the drone's wing. The Hellfire did not create a massive explosion that would endanger nearby civilian ships. It was designed to punch a small, incredibly hot hole through armor. The missile slammed into the back of the PACAP boat at 1,000 miles per hour. The boat's composite hull of plastic and glass offered no protection and disintegrated, the vessel vanishing beneath the waves. Simultaneously, the Fa-18 Super Hornets released their heavy hitters, the Joint Standoff Weapon. It was a 1,000-pound glider with wings, engineless and silent. 3 of these munitions arrived at the same time, targeting the IRGC hovercraft that were moving toward hidden underground pens. The hovercraft were massive, trying to beach themselves on the sand to hide. The Joint Standoff Weapon struck the propeller assembly of the lead hovercraft. The explosion sheared off the massive van, and the craft dropped onto the sand at 50 miles per hour, breaking apart into thousands of jagged pieces of metal and burning rubber. The entrance to the underground pen was now blocked by a mountain of scrap. The remaining PACAP boats realized they could neither hide nor run. They attempted to fight back, firing their NASA anti-ship missiles at the FA-18 Super Hornets, but without their land-based radar grid to guide them, their internal radars were weak. The EA-18G Growlers, still aloft, saw the NASA missiles launch and immediately pointed their jamming beams at the incoming threats. The missile's internal computers became confused, zigzagging wildly until they ran out of fuel and fell harmlessly into the water. The FA-18 Super Hornets did not waste another expensive missile on the last few boats. They rolled into a dive and switched to their 20mm cannons. The cannons fired a stream of rounds at 100 per second, each projectile the size of a large flashlight and made of heavy metal. Tracers streaked across the water toward the final PACAP boat. The heavy shells pierced the plastic hull, passing through both sides as if the boat were not even there. The craft stopped instantly, its nose dipping into the water as the hull filled with the sea. The IRGC had spent billions on stealth boats and a high-tech grid, but stealth only works if the enemy cannot see you. Once the United States took out the radar grid, the stealth boats became nothing more than slow-moving targets in a shooting gallery. The sea fell quiet again, except for the distant roar of the burning tanker. Yet the United States forces were not finished. They had destroyed the fleet, but to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, they needed to eliminate the brain of the IRGC Navy. The massive naval base at Bandar Abbas, protected by 20-foot reinforced concrete and hidden deep inside a mountainside, was their next target. Across the water on the coast of the United Arab Emirates, a battery of high-range launchers rotated their pods. They did not fire one shot at a time. They released a ripple of 6 rockets in 3 seconds, the pods emptying in rapid succession. Because the radar grid had already been unzipped, there was nothing to warn the base that the sky was about to fall. The rockets used GPS to find their exact targets. The first rocket struck the main fuel depot, a cluster of massive white tanks holding millions of gallons of high-octane diesel. The explosion expanded, a pressure wave moving outward at the speed of sound, flattening every fence and light pole within half a mile. A secondary blast sent black and orange fire into the air. The base's electricity and fuel vanished within the first 5 seconds, but the true devastation came from the sea. 200 meters away in the deep water of the Arabian Sea, a United States destroyer opened its vertical launch cells. A volley of Tomahawk cruise missiles climbed into the air, descending until they were at rooftop height, maneuvering around obstacles and staying invisible to any remaining ground sensors. 10 Tomahawk missiles arrived at Bandar Abbas simultaneously, targeting the heavy concrete docks where the IRGC reserve fleet was parked. The missiles slammed into the concrete pilings, where the docks met the water, erasing the ground the ships sat on. The explosion was so violent that the 1,000-ton concrete pier simply slid into the sea. Boats that had not been hit by missiles were crushed by the falling docks or flipped over by the waves. The IRGC might have had more boats in reserve, but now they had no place to park them, no fuel to run them, and no way to get them into the waters. Finally, the F-35C Lightning II stealth jets arrived to finish the job. They carried AGM-154 joint standoff weapons. 4 of these munitions were released, flying in a tight formation and striking the exact same spot on the mountainside. The first bomb cleared the dirt, the second cracked the concrete, and the third and fourth entered the hole, exploding deep inside the command center. The mount literally breathed fire. The brain of the IRGC Navy was now a smoldering ashtray. The ultimate grid had been physically removed from the map. 5 minutes had passed since the first high-range rocket left its pod. The EA-18G Growlers loitered 30,000 feet above the strait, their screens showing zero radar emissions. A high-altitude drone flew over Bandar Abbas, sending a live satellite feed back to the strike group and to the negotiation table in Doha, Qatar. The United States negotiator in Doha simply slid a tablet across the table to the Iranian diplomats. On the screen, they saw the empty spaces where their multi-million-dollar radar trucks had stood. The Doha betrayal had failed. Out in the strait, the 1,200-foot tanker still burned, but wind pushed the fire away from the shipping lane. A United States minesweeping vessel used high-frequency sonar to locate the underwater spheres, deploying a remotely operated robot to place a small charge on each chain. One by one, the iron spheres were triggered, the water erupting in small controlled geysers as the invisible wall was dismantled. The final act was electronic. The United States military turned off the jamming, allowing the Iranian diplomats to make a phone call home, only to discover that no one remained at the base to answer. Before the story ends, there is one thing about the AGM-88 harm that almost nobody mentions. The missile that ended the engagement was not originally designed as a smart weapon. At first, it was just a rocket with a simple ear. If it heard a radar, it flew toward it. The version used tonight had something called Home on Jam. The Iranians tried to jam US signals to protect their base, but the harm actually loves jamming. If the enemy hides behind electronic interference, the missile simply uses that interference as a guide. You cannot hide by turning the radar off, and you cannot hide by drowning out the signal. The very defense grid Iran built to be impenetrable was, in fact, the very thing that led the United States directly to their doorstep.